Good morning. We're in Ayin Beis, volume 3, page 1250. Aleph Resh Nun. The flow, after discussing how the midas, the emotions are elevated. They elevate the mind to new dimensions of transcendence, moichin de gadlus, all the way to gazing at, bringing Binah, the mother, up to the same stature as Chochma, and both of them gazing at the forehead of Arich, in which radiates the 370 energies of Atik. And then he said, but the Tachlis HaKavana is that it should also impact and elevate Malchus. It should be drawn down in Malchus, not just remain upward, but come down into Malchus and elevate Malchus. And this is all through Avodah. This does not happen on its own. It's through our work. On its own, you have a certain measure of Moichin being drawn into Midas and obviously also into Malchus, but it's a limited flow. And through the work and through our growth in our contemplation and in our comprehension and going even beyond that, to reaching these highest levels of love, of B'chol Meidecha, where we're completely absorbed, that the Avodah leads to highly new energies, unprecedented ones that were not there in the beginning of Seder Shtalshlus, in the structure of Seder Shtalshlus. So now, in explaining this Aliyah of Malchus, which is critical because Malchus represents the lowest level in the spheres and represents the earth, that's where everything grows. And that's what gives birth to the next generation, the next world of Bria. And the same thing, Malchus of Yitzira gives birth, Malchus of Bria gives birth to Yitzira, Malchus of Yitzira Tasiya. So explaining Malchus, he explained there's 3 levels of Malchus Aliyah, the elevation of Malchus. And they are called, in the language of the Eitz Chaim, Iber Yunike Meichin, they're called the Yihood of Hawaii and Adnai, the Yihood of Hawaii and Elikim, and the Yihood of Hawaii and Eya. And those correspond to Biti, Achesi, and Imi in the verse in Shir HaShirim. Biti is daughter, the daughter of the king, which means the daughter of Zoh Malchus, but it's in a state of Makabel. And what is that? Naveda, Kabbalah Soil. Or to put it more specifically, that's the union of mitzvahs, being a Keli, Ner Mitzvah, Evarim v'kelim, the Evarim the Malka, they're the limbs that contain the divine energy within them. And Aveda is Aveda Kabbalah Sel Dafka, which means just accepting, like Aveda Ha'eved, like a servant. Does not need to understand, does not need to know the reason, follows orders, just serves God. That's this level of Aveda of Biti, Makabel. And there's no Chabad is not radiating in there. I mean, a minimal way, obviously, because you need seichel always, even to do actions, even behavioral. But in this case, the Chabad is not radiating it. Everything is coming through Zah, like you said earlier, that Chabad. Then comes level number 2, which is the level of Achesi. Achesi is equal status with the Zah. It's a sibling, a sister. So the Melech is now calling Malchus a sister. Why? Because now Chabad does come into play, because standing equal to Zoh, it's receiving from Abba ve'ima. And what is that? Aveda, that's Aveda with Seichel. And the example, continuing with the example of the servant, it's not a servant in the king's empire, in the king's leadership, in the king's the king's governing, but it's the actual governors, the ministers. The Sari HaMelucha, who, on the contrary, they can't just do by following orders. They have to apply themselves and analyze and evaluate and actually be part of, and they're the process of actually writing the laws, which the king generally will follow, will ratify, I should say. So they are therefore beferish using Chabad, and they, what is it in Aveda, in the Nimshal? These are the poskim, the Tanoim and Amirayim, like he said, the Yesmel, the poskim, like the advisors of the king. And here, the Malchus de Rakia in the heavenly kingdom, this is Torah Shabbat as Malchus, but Torah Shabbat is, of course, all the laws that tell us what to do, what's kosher, what's not kosher. And who determines that? These are the Tanoim and Amoraim and the Poskim who determine what is based on the logic that God implanted in Torah. They evaluate and they analyze and they come away with the laws of what's capable of being elevated. That's what kosher is. And psul, puzzle, something not permitted means that's something not able to be elevated, the sparks, as we discussed. And the poskim hema tanoim v'amaroim shenikraim sodim kesar lefnei hamelach shelehem nitnu in yoni Torah. They were given, that was what they're given, that right and that responsibility to sheyechtechu, that they should dissect and analyze, and they should determine the laws with their chochma, with their das and their binah, with their wisdom and understanding and knowledge and understanding in Torah. And he gives the example of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel and the other Tanoim Meroim that determined halach is like this or like that. And that's the way it was set up. The ikar avedasim ugamkim b'meichin dafke. And their primary avodah is with meichin. This is not just servitude and Kabbalah sale, just following the orders. This is actually creating the reasoning behind all the laws. I'm just reading the last lines we learned. They're called Evdei Hashem b'nishmasam. They're those that serve God with their soul. Their work is in understanding the divine understanding or understanding the divine and cleaving and attaching to Elikus. This is the level of my sister. Because the root of these souls is the neshamas is from Atzilus, where they're called Achim Bereim, brothers and friends, LaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. Shenatzalu im akelim dezah. No, that's where. Oh no. Where did I stop? I stopped here, and I read another line. That shenatzalu im akelim dezah yachad abba ve'ima. So even though they are rooted in Malchus of Atzilus, but it's not Malchus as a daughter, but it's Malchus as an equal, because they emanate. Shenatzalu with the kelim of Zah together from a Chochma and Binah. So now they have a direct link to Chochma and Binah, just like Zah has. Not like the first level, BT is the Kabbalah sale of the servant. There, the Chochma and Binah are going through Zah. The main thing is listening to what the Eibishter has to say. Here, Malchus is elevated, and these neshamas are rooted in the place that stands side by side with Zah, and Netzalu, when they were emanated from the divine, from the Maitzil, when the Maitzil emanated and imparted these energies, here we're talking about this level where Zah, where Malchus standing by Zah, and they receive Abba ve'ima from Chochma, and he explains Kemashkosa ba'bir ha'bezi yeinosi, and l'chein niklaim achim l'gaba Zah. And that's where they're called brothers in compared to Zah, Kemashkosa ba'geras ha'kedesh. No, okay, here's where we stopped. Here's where I believe where we stopped. Okay, so that's a summary of what we learned. I just want to now finish the paragraph, and it's not finished. He's going to conclude now this point. And now he quotes, I'm reading from the line that begins, Hakelim Dezah, 2/3 of the way down on page 1250, Aleph Resh Nun. These pages can be found at ayinbeis.com, where you have the PDFs of these texts. So it says, this is the famous Ageres HaKedesh cited quite a few times in Ayin Beis. Siman Chof it is. It's the 20th epistle in Ageres HaKedesh, is structured in Simonim, and it begins, Iyu v'chayu ichad, that you and your chayu energies or your Chabad are one, however it's explained. There he explains it as Eris. So this is a very classic Ageres HaKedesh. This is the same Ageres HaKedesh where he talks about Mitzyusi Matzmusei, that only God can create something, a yesh, that doesn't feel it has a source. Talks about talks about neshamas. So he's quoting now a piece from there. So what does he say? That neshamas, these neshamas are shehein me'ein b'chinas alikus. These neshamas are me'ein. They're similar to the level of pure divinity, but in a state of betzimtzum otzim. but not tzimtzum otzim, because they're already a form of neshamas. So even though they're rooted, as we learned in the beginning of Tanya, chelik elakam emal mamish, but as the neshamas evolve, like he explains in chapter 2 in Tanya, as they branch and they go through Chochma, says from Chochma is Baruch, and then they branch as they travel downward, like branching out from their source. So they are a state of elikus, but elikus in that tzimtzum otzum, in an intense or an extreme level of tzimtzum. They're elikus, but they're very diminished. Uke'ein, and this is what he says in Nageres Kedesh. So this is the proof he wants to bring, and they're similar to hakelim d'Atzilus, the containers of Atzilus. So you see from this that these neshamas that we're talking about in Atzilus are on a level in Atzilus like the kelim of Atzilus. I'll explain that in a moment. Well, I'll explain it right now. The Lashon of the Rambam, the Alter Rebbe says, in other words, they're similar to the level of the kelim, but with one important qualification, that they exited. They're like ready outside from and separated from the kelim. So this is a very key line in Chassidus that's analyzed pretty extensively by the different Maimorim, especially the Rebbe Rashab, what this means exactly. So let me explain it. The relevance you'll see in a moment to our discussion here. The simple question you could ask, based on chapter 2 in Tanya, the neshama is a chelik elakam emal mamish. It's obviously called neshama. Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim, like he says, vayipach is not just regular speaking. Vayipach means coming from God's inner depths. Like in the example, when a person blows with intensity, they breathe very heavily into something. It's not just regular speech. It's coming from their inners. Like he says, from the insides. What does it mean in the nimshal? It's coming from the deeper dimensions of the divine. So basically, comparing it, let's say, to the creation of every other entity, a neshama is very different. 6 days of creation before we have V'yipach ba'apav nishmas chaim, that God created the human being with a soul that he breathed into it. What did God do when he created the animals? What did he do when he created the vegetation? When he created the fish in the sea, or the birds in the sky, or for that matter, semeach, vegetation, as I said, and daimim, and mineral. Didn't he also imbue it with his energy? Of course he did. That's why Vayemer Elikim Yehi Oyer, Vayemer Elikim Yehi Rakia. And the Alter Rebbe says in Shiur V'Amuna that every second, this divine energy has to constantly renew the creation or it ceases to be. So essentially, the material world as we see it and know it is simply divine energy within it that's giving it sustenance every moment. So what's the difference between the creation of a stone or a tree or a horse and a neshama? They're all coming from God. The answer is right there, Vayomer Elikim. It doesn't say Vayipach ba'apav. Vayomer Elikim, using Torah Dibra b'lashon b'nei Adam, Torah speaks in the language of man. So using an example for a human example, when you speak, you're not using all the intensity of your innards as when you really deeply blow, or in this case, breathe into something. So in the nimshal, it means that the divine energy is different levels. For example, where do you invest most of your energy? In the things you love and you care about. When you do menial things, like walking in the street or brushing your teeth, or things that are superficial, you also are investing some energy in it, but it's a minimal amount of energy. When you're doing something for your child, or for someone you love, or for yourself, and it's important, you put a lot more energy, so you can have levels of energy. So in other words, creation itself is created by divine energy, but not yet the inner kavanah, so to speak, which only a neshama has. Because the horse or the tree or the frog or the vegetation and the mineral, they are all necessary in creation, but they're not the purpose of creation. Like we speak many times, the example of building a house. The bricks and mortar and the electricity and the plumbing and all the details are necessary. Without that, you don't have a home. But what's the kavanah pnimius? Is to live there. Yes, you need gold, silver, copper, and other materials to build the mishkan, but that's just the keli. What is the bottom line? Is when you bring these vessels in there and you actually serve God, whether it's in the Kodesh Kodashim in the Holy Ark, or through the other contain, or through the Keteris or the Mizbeach of bringing offerings, or the Menorah or the Shulchan, that's when V'shachanti b'seichem is the Kavanah. So in the creation, you have invested a certain amount of what we call Chetsenius HaChayis, or Chetsenius HaRatzon. And the Pnimius HaRatzon is in the Neshamas. So now comes the question, if that's the case, so why do Neshamas need Torah mitzvahs? In chapter 4 in Tanya, which I actually began teaching this past Saturday night, he explains the whole thing. You need to have Torah mitzvahs. Why do you need Torah mitzvahs? The neshama itself is divine. And it has the power, not like the rest of creation. So here is the key explanation based on this Ageres HaKedesh. So though the neshamas may retain, and their very identity is chelik elokam and malmamish, but they do evolve. They do have to come down to this world. So they go through the whole Seder Shtalshus, and that affects the neshama. So though the spark or the actual inner identity always remains a chelik elokam and malmamish, but as the neshamas go down, even in chapter 2, he speaks about neshamas that are on the level of the heel, akvayim. He talks about pshutim, noshim pshutim, simple people, and talks about even Peishi Yisrael, even people who defy God. How's that possible? If the neshama is a divine entity, how could it ever go away from its divine identity? The answer is because it's nishtalshel. So the neshamas, when they come into Atzilus, they're like the kelim, ke'en, the kelim of Atzilus, but yotzu v'nifradu. The kelim, let's say the keli of chesed of Atzilus, or the keli of Chochma of Atzilus, or Binah, or any one of the 10 spheres, both the energy and the container are always divine. They can never lose that divinity in Atzilus. But the neshamas have an additional element to them. They're not just there as the structure of existence, even the divine structure, they have to come into this world. So on one hand, they have even more power, but they also, on the other hand, they have to be able to separate from, and that the divine element in them should be concealed, or else if they came to this world, there'd be no free will, and there'd be no ability to do what they have to accomplish, which is engage with the world and transform it. So yes, we have the power of the neshama even on earth, but the neshama's power is now in a state of tzimtzum otzum until it becomes like the kelim of Atzilus. Then it goes further, yotzu and nifredu. They come out, in other words, so they originate there, but then they originate actually higher, but they go through the level of the kelim, and then they yotzu v'nifredu, as if like now they're being sent out of the palace of the king, which is Atzilus, and to go into Bria. So you say, Atan barasa, atan yitzarta, atan nefachta bi, atan meshamra b'kirbi, to come into this world. And here there'll be neshamas that retain that element of kelim of Atzilus, like the Tanoim and Amoraim. So they retain that, and that's why they are able to paskin. But many other neshamas don't have that element. But even those neshamas, Tanoim Amoraim, also yotzav and nifredu. They also came into this world. And that's why you need Torah mitzvahs. Because without Torah mitzvahs, the neshama does have essential divine character different than any other creation in the world, but it has to be revealed in a tangible way and internalized in us. And that's where the learning of Torah, when you use your mind to learn Torah, and you do mitzvahs, which like he explains in chapter 4 in Tanya, that through your thought, speech, and action, you create garments for the tayyag mitzvahs. So then that brings alive both the chelik elokam and malmamish, and in an internalized way. So Torah mitzvahs never loses its divine, well, I shouldn't say lose, their divine element never gets concealed. In a neshama, it doesn't lose it, but it gets concealed. So Torah mitzvahs and the neshama together achieve these, that's why you need both of them. It's a side point, not relevant to this, but going back to the discussion here, he's bringing from Ageres HaKedesh proof. I should say one more thing with the neshamas, that the end the neshamas are higher than Torah. That's why pikuach nefesh is stronger than Torah, deche kol ha-Torah kula, because the Torah was given for Jews, not the Jews were given for Torah. But Torah has that element of divine connection. In some ways, you could say Torah is like Zah, and neshamas are like Malchus. So initially, Zah is higher, it gives guidance and instructs the Jew, the neshama, what to do. But as the neshama elevates, the neshama will ultimately be mashpia in Torah, as we shall learn soon. But right now, we're talking about level 2, where the neshama is equal to Zah, meaning because it has the power to paskin halachas and understanding the way to get to that. And so we see from the Geras HaKedesh that the neshamas in Atzilus are ke'ein hakelim, but then they extended outward, yotzu v'nifredu. U'kamesha kosu b'biuri hazeir, like he says in Biur Hazeir, I'm continuing. Pinchas, al posuk u'b'chedesh harishin. So in Pinchas, on the posuk u'b'chedesh harishin, where he talks about the holidays. So the Biur Hazeir is the Biur Hazeir. Again, the Mittel Rebbe published it and composed it, but it's based on the Maimorim that the Alter Rebbe said on Zeir, just like the Siddur is based on that, is the Mittel Rebbe published it and gathered all the Maimorim the Alter Rebbe said in connection to the different prayers in the Siddur, in the prayer book. So Biur Hazeir, Pinchas, on this pasuk, Chedesh Harishon, he says that Kelim that Atzilus hin al derech moshel machshava atzmius. That the Kelim of Atzilus are, for example, machshava atzmius, an essential or core thought. What does that mean? Hainu shecheshev davar hanegei la'atzmei. So you could have a thought, for example, that you got to repair your car, or you have your thought you got to take a walk. But then there's a machshava atzmis where you're thinking about something that's negayed to you. It's important, negayed, not just in a technical way, negayed to your life, negayed to your mission in life, and so on. V'hanashamas hein kameshacheshev davar hashayach el azulas. And the shamas, in contrast to machshava atzmis, the kelim of Atzilus, they are like you're thinking about something that's negated to you. And the neshamis is thinking about something that's neshayach, that relates to another. So I want to qualify what I just said. I stand by what I said as far as the difference between thinking about yourself and thinking about something trivial. But the real point he wants to make is the difference between thinking about yourself and thinking about another. So though neshamis are on the same, originate in Atzilus and are similar to the kelim, the difference is, and the way this Biur Hazeir is explaining the Geras HaKedesh, what means yotzu v'nifredu? What does it practically mean? It means that neshamas can relate the way God is relating to another. The thought is relating to another. This is why the neshamas can come down to this world and relate to the world around it. Kelim of Atzilus don't come down, yotzu v'nifredu. They remain in their divine status. But neshamas are the way the machshav is kedavar sheichel al azulas v'hainu she'aneshamas hein davar b'fnei atzmei. This means that the neshamas are a separate entity. Now that doesn't take away from the chelik elokah mimal mamish. It just means the chelik elokah is manifesting as if like there's I don't want to use the same mashal he's using here, but the similar would be the chief of staff or the people who work inside the palace. They remain in the palace. The shamas are like the shluchim of the king of Hashem that he sends outside of his palace, outside of Atzilus, down to this world. So the shamas and davar b'fnei atzmei retain their divine element, but they have also now this ability to go outside of the sacred domain of the divine domain of Atzilus. The ein hakav me'erein sof belubish behem, and the kav of erein sof does not manifest in them. It's not enclosed in them. In kelim of Atzilus, it is enclosed, but in them it's concealed. It's not enclosed. Like it is with the containers where you and your containers are one, as he explains in Geras HaKedesh, mashenkim b'neshamas. Because neshamas have a role to go transform something outside of Atzilus. It's a little similar, just on a much lower level, when you say the difference between angels, malachim, and neshamas. A malach can be God's messenger to this world with one message, the message of, let's say, coming to Avram, that you're going to have a child. But the malach doesn't have the power to transform this world, and that's why when the malachim said at the end of Bereshis, they said to Hashem, look how corrupt the people are. So God says, yeah, go down there and you'll see how you can do. And they became much worse than the Nephilim, because they don't have that energy. Their power is in their spiritual domain. Take them out of their spiritual domain, they lose their power. So all they can do is be sent as a messenger and they return. They remain spiritual entities, and that's their place. It's like taking a fish out of water. The fish will not be able to survive outside of water. A neshama has an additional power, which actually means it's even deeper, that it can go down to this world and not only not be affected, but transform this world. Now, it's relevant in the bigger picture. What's relevant to us right now is to say why it's achesi and set the stage for the next level of imi. It's still not the mother that's mashpia. Now, at least, it's not just a makabel kabbalah sale. It's using its mind to paskin halachas, like we said, like the Sarei HaMelech, like the ministers of the king. The neshamis are, and they are Ivdei Hashem b'nishmosam gam b'meichin, but they have this additional element that they are separate entity. The sister is not the brother. Malchus is not Zah, didn't become one with Zah. It's on the same level as Zah. So it's on the same level as the Kalim of Atzilus, but it's a separate entity because Yatzav and Nifradu as a separate entity, like the Tanoim Amoraim, they're completely dedicated to God, but they are separate entities that are studying, evaluating, and paskening halachas and Torah Sheba'al Peh. So here we have the second level where Malchus has elevated, not just as a recipient, like a servant, and just following orders, actually involved in the very process, like a partner with Zah in developing the Torah and paskening are based on Chochma and Binah, Abba ve'Ima, because it's receiving from there. So it's equal stature to Zah, with the qualification, like we just said, that it's still a separate entity, but it's on that Ramah, on that same stature. And that's why they work with their minds to develop, not just like the Eved, that the Eved is just a listener, basically a recipient, and here they're also part of the very process of developing Torah. And that concludes this paragraph. So I'll stop now if anybody wants to ask any questions. And then there's going to be continuing discussion on Achesi. And then the next page is going to go to the third level of elevation of Imi, the mother. Okay. Good. So now we continue. Ubezeh Yuvan, next paragraph. And with this will be understood. Masha Amr Azal, Ksubis Daf Kuv Gimel Amar Aleph. The Gemara in Ksubis, page 103a, Kuv Gimel Amar Aleph. So it talks there about Kabed es Avicha v'Esimecha. So one of the 10 commandments, the fifth of the 10 commandments, is honor your father and mother. And the Gemara talks about. So the Gemara says, Vav Yeseda, there's an extra Vav, Kabed es Avicha v'Esimecha.
Where are you holding? I don't see that.
Where?
The new paragraph. Ubez Yuvan Masha Amar Rizal.
Ksubis Daf Kuv Gimel Amar Aleph, Vav Yeseda, L'Rabis Achicha Hagadol. What don't you see?
You were talking about the.
What do you? You don't see the words, or you don't understand? I'm explaining. But what don't you see?
You said keep it Abraham.
Yeah, that's the pasuk we're talking about. I'm explaining. I'm explaining what we're learning here.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, so Vav Yeseda, the Gemara says, L'Rabbi Achicha Hagadol, that there's an extra Vav, and that comes to what does it come to add? That also you have to honor not just parents, but also Achicha Hagadol, the older brother, your older brother. Now, another place it says, I think in the same Gemara, that sometimes it says Es, Kabed Es Avich. Why does it say Kabed Avicha V'imecha? What's Es Avicha? So it says Es L'Rabbis. But I think there's another opinion that says Vav. I have to look inside. But basically saying that the Vav comes to add, a Vav always comes to add something. It comes to add Achicha Hagadol. So you see, he's going to explain now this Gemara based on what we just learned about brother, sister. That's this level. Because it's explained elsewhere. And in the parentheses, he tells us where the elsewhere is. Bedrush lahavinin in Eidin Sof the Tovkuf Samach Zayin. So this is a famous mimer from the Alter Rebbe, which begins lahavin inyan Eidin Sof to understand the idea of Eidin Sof, and it's from the year Tovkuf Samach Zayin. So you can find this mimer in Sefer Me'amori Admur HaZaken Tovkuf Samach Zayin, that Samach Tzedek. The Samach Tzedek has explanations on this mimer. All the Rabbeim explained this mimer over the years. Just to tell you, it's a very fundamental mimer. So what does he say there in the mimer? He's bringing Inyan Vov de Vahaneira. So there's a pasuk Hagadol Gibber Vahaneira. You say God is Hagadol, great, Gibber, strong, Vahaneira, and awesome. So what is the Vov? It says God Hagadol Hagibber, but doesn't say Haneira. Why does it say Vahaneira? So the Alter Rebbe explains, this mimer explains, Shehu Pchines Hakav Hanimshech Me'erein Sof. This is referring to the Kav. A Kav is like a Vov, like a line. The Kav is a thin line. It's called Kav V'chut. Kav means a line. Chut means a thread. That after the Tzimtzum, that completely concealed the divine consciousness pre-Tzimtzum, then comes a Kav, a stream of consciousness, a stream of a flow. The Kav, he says, the Vav refers to the Kav that comes from Erein Sof. Like we learned just the last line in the last paragraph, he's talking about the Kav in the Kalim that does not manifest in the Neshama. So he's explaining now. The Ikaram Shachu B'Kavam Tzoi. He's explaining now that that when we say Vahaneira, Godla Gibber Vahaneira usually refers to Chesed, Gvura, and Teferes. Teferes is the middle Kav. So even though they're all Kavim, Chochma, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, but like he says in his parentheses, the primary Amshach is Kav Tzoi. So the Kav is sometimes referred to as being like the Kav Tzoi, the middle line or the middle pillar, which is sometimes Teferes Mavriach Min HaKotza LaKotza, that goes from one end to the next end. Okay. And therefore, Mitzad B'chinas Vav Zeh, and that's why this Vav comes due to this Vav of the Kav, Nimshech L'Rabbi Sachicha Agadol. It comes to include the older brother. What does this mean? Because it's going to go back to this point. We said before the Vav, the Kav does not go into the Neshamas of Atzilus. So he says like this, Ki ima yesh ha-neshamas Atzilus nikra achim v'reim, that even though the souls of Atzilus are called brothers and friends, l'zah, to Zayir Ampin, remember Malchus says it's on equal stature with like a brother and a friend, like a sister, brother and friend. To Zah, l'kol mokem, nikra zah achicha god l'kaba neshamas. Nevertheless, Zah still has something over these neshamas, and it's called Achicha HaGadol, the older brother. So it's not called a parent. When the Malchus is in the level of Biti, so then Zah is the father, the king. When Malchus elevates to Zah, you call it brother or sister, but it's not Achicha HaGadol. Achicha HaGadol still, Zah still has something over Malchus, even when Malchus elevates to this state, and he calls that Achicha HaGadol, the older brother. And that's his connection to the Vav, the Kav. What does this mean? What's the logic here? The Levad Gadlus HaKelim L'Gaba Neshamas. Besides the fact that the growth and the maturity of the containers, here he means the containers of Zah, but he's speaking Kelim in general, compared to Neshamas. So like it says in L'Kut Teira there. Now, where's this L'Kut Teira? Where was the last time he mentioned L'Kut Teira? Was I think Yeinosi, Habeis, Habir, the second beer in the Maimer of Yeinosi. Yeah, like a few lines back. She says, so there in the Kutateri, he talks about what Kalim have over Neshamas. Remember, I explained before that Neshamas have the power to come down and separate from Atzilus and the Kalim and to come into this world and transform it. But the Kalim of Atzilus have the quality, they remain Atzilus. Neshama does not remain and retain in a revealed way its Atzilus nature. It goes through Bria, Ata Barasa, Ata Yitzata, Ata Nafachta Bi, Ata Meshamra Bikirbi. So the Kalim's quality is that they retain that, and so therefore they have a certain godless and maturity and development, like he explains in Likutei Torah, that the neshamas don't have. Mashenkin ben that the neshamas compared to the kelim are a ha'orek tana, a small reflection. We're talking now in the intensity of the gilui. We're not talking about the etzem of the neshama. We're not talking about the etzem here. We're talking about in the intensity of the gilui, the kelim. He says Likutei Torah have that godless, so a certain element of expanded, or you could say developed revelation, whereas the neshamas is a ha'orek tana compared to the kelim. So levad zois, besides that, and he was explaining why, even though Malchus is now a brother or sister, it's still not on the same level of the kelim of Zah. Says number one reason is based on the Likutei Torah. Besides the fact that the neshamas are like a small reflection compared to the godless of the kelim, in addition to that, there's a mile is an additional advantage in the kelim mitzad havov shu b'chinas hakav me'erein sof hameir behem. There's an additional advantage that due to the vav, which is the kav, that the very original stream, basically the main power line in Atzilus, which is the kav, the vav, radiates in them. Not mashenkim and neshamas. It doesn't radiate neshamas because the neshamas need to be somewhat freed. I don't say freed, but they cannot be completely impacted by it, or else they wouldn't be able to leave Atzilus and do their job. So the kelim have both these qualities. One is that they're in a more expanded state. He says Likutei Torah, whereas the neshama is ha'orek tana, and in addition to that, even they have the quality of the vav of the kav that radiates in them. So they're more attached, so to speak, in a revealed way to the main line, which is the kav, the vav, which makes them the achicha agadol. Ulechein, and that's why tachlis ilui hanashamis, the ultimate ilui, the ultimate elevation, but even more, ilui would mean the ultimate quality, the ultimate level that neshamas can reach, highest level, is what? Is lishtaba begufa de malka, to bind themselves in the gufa de malka, which means the very body of the king, which is zah, the hainu b'bchinas hakelim, which means the level of the kelim of zah of Atzilus. Uba'ir hakav hamislabish behem, and in the ir hakav, the light, the energy that comes from this main line, the vav of kav that manifests in them, like I explained before from Perek Dal and Tanya. So yes, the ultimate purpose of neshamas is to fulfill the ultimate purpose of God, which is lasis leis baruch dere b'tachtein, to come down in this world and make a home for the divine in this material existence. And in that sense, only neshamas can achieve that. But if you're talking about for the neshama itself, what is its where is its highest status? Where does it reach its highest level? The neshama is when it binds itself with God Himself, with the kelim of Atzilus and the kav. Now the neshama has to come down, but the goal is ultimately is to connect, and that's why I mentioned before you need to have the Torah mitzvahs that does that. In the language of Atzilus, the kelim of Atzilus that carry that level of higher energy. It would be like saying, like let's say the Rebbe sends out a shliach to a city, and he works hard. Now, he's definitely not in the palace of the king when he's doing that. He's gone to a secular, maybe even hostile environment that is antithetical initially, at least on a surface level, to things that are godly. And he's bringing Torah, Chassidus, and making it a godlier place. But at times he has to go back to the power source to recharge his batteries. Just like in the month of Tishrei, even though the kavanah is to bring the power of Tishrei into the entire year, but once a year we're given a month where we essentially recharge ourselves and reload and regain all our resources. Essentially, it's like rearm ourselves with all the resources. It's like soldiers going out into the battlefield but there needs to be a supply line that they go back to get their supplies. And they have to replenish. That's the word I wanted. Replenish their resources. But then you have to go out. So you need to have both elements. So where's the neshama replenish and where's it ultimately its highest state is when it completely gets attached to the kalim of Atzilus, where the kav is radiating. It's like going back into the power source, into the engine room. And then returning to fulfill its mission. So what do you see from this? Why is that the ultimate goal? The neshama itself is a chelik elikam mamash. Why does it have to be lishtaba begufet demalka? Because it needs to be in a revealed way, in a way that the neshama experiences it. So that's what he's saying. That's why the ilui is tachas el neshama is to the kelim and the kav that manifests in them. Like he says in Tere'er, b'dibra maskul zocher Hashem Shabbos habeis. In the Maimer called Zocher Hashem Shabbos, the second discourse by the name Zocher Hashem Shabbos. You may notice, as I pointed out a number of times, there are times in Ayin Beis where the Rebbe Rashab begins to just pour out all his many sources. I read now in the last 2 pages especially, a bunch of Maimorim that he's already brought, at least 5, 6, if not more, by name. So even though many parts of Ayin Beis are based on Maimorim from before, whatever reason, the Rebbe Rashab does not always mention where they are. Here, he's already said in this own section, he's already brought L'Havanin in Erein Sof Tavkuf Samach Zayin. He referred to L'Kutei Teira before. Now this Teira. You go back to the last paragraph. You have Biruri Azer Ageres HaKedesh, that L'Kutei Teira Yenosi. Before that was another Maimer that he brought, which was that right a few lines before was another from the Siddur. He brought a few sources, actually more like 10 sources than 5. The more I look at it right now. Now, why that's the case, I can't tell you, because as I said, there are times that he brings entire sections from other Maimorim and doesn't mention it, but I'm just pointing it out. Brought the Siddur twice. I remember, the Siddur. Now that I'm curious, I'm ready looking here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So now what he's added here is to explain that even though it's called Achesi, sister or brother, but Zah is still the Achicha Hagadol. So it's no longer daughter. Malchus is elevated to the equal status of brothers and a brother. Even if it's a younger brother or a younger sister, it's still a sister and a sibling. So there's a certain equal stature, but still there's something in the Kalim of Zah that Malchus does not have on its own. So now he says, Umakol Mokim, and nevertheless, Neshamis Elu, these souls, Ma'achashenim Shochim Mibchinis Abba Ve'ima, being that they came from Abba Ve'ima, Chochma Binah, just like Zah did, because we're saying they're all born from the same parents. These are siblings. We're not talking about the daughter, the level of Malchus as daughter to Zah. We're talking about how Malchus is now an Achesi, a sister, which is an equal sibling to the Zah, both coming from Chochma Binah. So he says, because neshamas come from Chochma Binah, they receive from Chabad just as Zah receives from Chabad. Even a younger brother or sister receives from their parents. They were born from the same parents, and they receive their sustenance from the same parents. So yes, there's an element of an achicha agod, an older brother, but at the same time, the neshamas are receiving from the same parents as Zah is receiving. In Avodah, that means that there's Chabad radiating in Malchus here as it is a sister, or the level that he calls Achim. He doesn't discuss the difference why he calls it sometimes sister, sometimes brother. It's another discussion. But Pashtas, the reason is because Malchus is Nekeva. So it's a daughter, a sister, and a mother. And Achim in general refers to all the levels of neshamas, also the male ones that are brothers to Zah and equals. But that doesn't go into the details here. So it's also Mekabel Mechabat. Ulechein, now he goes back to what he said before. That's why they're masters of Torah. We talked about the Tanoim, the Amoraim, the Poskim. They're masters of Torah. They're not just servants. Lefarish, ulevaya, to interpret, and levaya, and to explain, Dinei HaTorah, the laws of the Torah, like he said in the middle of the page. Ulehoides, and to guide, and to show direction, give the direction. To direct. Shezeu hamshachas b'chinas hamoichin da'araisa. Shezeu hamshachas b'chinas hamoichin. This is hamshach of moichin, because you don't come to a place of that without moichin. This isn't just about listening to orders. This is about processing and learning and developing and coming to conclusions and arguing it out and coming to conclusions. This is the level of moichin, mamshich moichin da'araisa mechochma nafkas. Because Torah, which is what they're immersed in, comes from Chochma. It originates, it's derived from Chochma. V'zeu inya v'teira eir. And this is v'teira eir. Remember we said by biti, the bottom of last page, we said ner mitzvah. It's the candle of the mitzvah, is a keli. Now we're talking about teira eir. This is teira eir. Shezeu hamshachas hameichim shanikra eir. The hamshach of meichem that called eir, Keneda, as it's known. Now you could say, 1 second, didn't we just learn that the neshamas are on the level of kelim of Atzilus, kelim of Zah? Now we're suddenly calling them Ur. So obviously, even keli has both sides to it. As I mentioned many times, a keli here is not a cup. A keli means a receptacle. Compared to Malchus of Atzilus as its a daughter, Biti, Zah is Ur. But in Zah itself, there's kelim of Zah, which give it its identity. And compared to higher levels, it's that. But if you compare it, the daughter, like the servant, is just being is a real keli. All it is receiving and listening to orders. Here we're talking about Bali Torah, who are using their minds, and the minds and Torah is all hamshach of Ur. But if you talk technically, in Atzilus is the level of the kelim of Atzilus. You could also say that neshamas itself have an Ur and a keli. The Ur is when they're Isik, when they're involved in the Torah, and the keli is their identity as they will come neshamas and leave the kelim and come down to earth. So neshama too has an Ur and a keli, besides the body, its own 2 dimensions. So it's not a contradiction to what we've been learning. Now he's going to contrast this back to Biti, to Bas. This all is a sister, which is receiving directly from Chochma and Binah. Mashenkin Bas, by contrast, Bas, like he spoke about at the top of this page, he b'chinas kiyuma mitzvahs b'peil mamash. There, the avodah is for the performance of mitzvahs in action. Sha mitzvah hi api chachmei haTorah. The mitzvah and the performance of the mitzvah is according to the sages of Torah, the wise ones of Torah. They give the direction, they give the guidance as they learn and develop the halachas. Shehem b'chinas sarim, they are the level of ministers. Va'eved, top of page 1251, and the servant who rak l'kayim es hamitzvos, k'may shemefurish al pi haTorah. So the ministers of Torah, in this case, are the ones that study and develop and give God, they give the direction, l'hoires, like he says, l'farish l'vaya dinei Torah l'hoires, and to direct and guide. Biti, on the other hand, is the performance, the actual performance, based on the servant is implementing and performing that which the Sarim guided him to do. And that's just to fulfill the mitzvahs, as they are explained, or they're interpreted, or they are mefurish, explicitly stated, al pi haTorah, the Torah that was given to him by the ministers, by the ones that developed the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Not talking about Torah Shebiksav, obviously is given from above. Talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh. V'zeu shenikra b'chinas mekabel. And this is the meaning that he's called the level of Makabel, Biti, the daughter. The level of Malchus on Malchus level doesn't have any light and energy of its own, like the moon. It's the Eved on his own has no direction. Tell me what to do, he's waiting to hear. He doesn't have the power and the ability to interpret the mitzvahs according to his, the Eved, the servant's das, and Hasaga, according to his perception and his comprehension. So now comes a long parenthesis, I believe, which I choose now to skip the parentheses. I just will read the last 3 lines, and I'll go back to the parentheses. It'll just be a little easier for us. So he says the parentheses goes all the way to 3 lines before the end of the paragraph. So he says like this. I'm skipping the parentheses, and then we'll learn it again. We'll learn it back. We'll go back to it. So he says, so he doesn't have the power and the capacity to interpret mitzvahs on his own. He needs to be makabel that from someone. Rak shemakabel mahasarim. 3 lines from the end of the paragraph. He only receives that from the ministers. Which means he now knows how to perform the mitzvahs the way the Torah wants him to perform, according to the way the Torah indicates. And according to this, we have to say, the Gamasha Makablim Mizah Eino Mebchinas Chabad Kiima Madregas Atachtenis. So in addition to the fact that he's not receiving from Chabad because the Eved is not connected is just connected to the action and not to the mind behind it, but also as he receives from Zoh, you could say maybe he receives from Chabad of Zoh. She says it's not from Chabad, but from the lower Kiima Madregas Atachtenis. Because you could argue that the daughter, the servant, doesn't receive directly from the original Chabad, but it receives some intelligence through Zoh. He says even that not, because all it is about not having any of its own seichel. All it is fulfilling, at least in this interpretation, as he's explaining it here in Ayin Beis, it's only receiving from the lower levels of Zoh to know what it has to do. These are the commands. This is what you need to do. Aval hasorim, but the ministers, on the other hand, she'emare Torah, who are the masters of Torah, hainu shemekablim mebchinas Chabad, which means that they receive from Chabad. Chabad not of Zoh, Chabad of Atzilus, Abba ve'ima. And he says also das now. V'hei mashpiyim b'chinas ha'er v'agili. And they're mashpiyah to the Evet, to the Bas. They transmit the er and gili, the light, the energy and the light. So now he's covered Biti and Achesi, and what we didn't cover is the parentheses. Because of time, what I'm going to do now is stop for questions, and tomorrow I'll go back to the parentheses that we skipped right now. It'll be easier to understand because he breaks it down a little more intricately, these levels. So we finish the paragraph here on page 1251 without the parentheses. So floor is yours if anybody has any questions.
So one implication of all this so far is that our neshama is essentially a little schizophrenic, meaning parts of our neshamas are more informed and guiding us, have more locus, and that's the sarim, that's the achosi, and then parts of our neshamas are just like avadim, like servants, just doing the mitzvahs, and they're just following their instructions. In other, so our neshamas
not the way I would not put it that way. I would not put it that way.
Well, but he's talking about one neshama. It's at different levels, no?
So I'll explain. So first of all, he's not necessarily talking about one neshama. He's talking about all neshamas. But most importantly, every neshama needs these 3 levels. So even the greatest tzaddikim have Kabbalah soil, and when they follow what God wants them to do. So everybody has the level of Bas, and everybody also has the level of Achesi, because even though there's an element to Kabbalah say, we also have a mitzvah to learn Torah. And then everybody's also going to have the level of Imi. So first of all, so all neshamas have these 3. The second point is when you talk about roles in general, you don't need this mimer, but in general, the pasuk and the Torah says, Moshe and Aaron were the leaders. The Korach had an issue with that. He said everybody's holy, but nevertheless, there is a hierarchy. There are scholars, there are Yisachar, Zvulun, scholars, business people. In the Tzavim, you have 10 different categories. Reshechem, Shiftechem, all the way the heads of the tribes, all the way to the water carriers and the wood choppers. So the idea that there are levels in the neshamas is that's a given on everywhere. We even learned it here on page 12. I pointed out the other day on page 1225, talks about the different levels of souls. So overall, yes, there are generally different levels of souls, that some primarily could be more biti and some more primarily achesi and some imi. But always every soul has these three all the time. And it's just a matter of what's a priority. And just like it says that a business person also has to learn Torah every day, even though he doesn't learn all day. And a Talmid Chacham who learns all day also has to give tzedakah, charity. So this in general is a rule that everything belongs to everybody. It's just a question, priority, primary, and what stage in a person's life, and you could say more child, just like we spoke about all the last 20, 30 pages about the development from mudva, murgish, muskel, that ultimately, now I'm not talking about the biologically, you're a child only once, but in Aveda, these levels are constantly renewed. In other words, we can go through it every day. In the morning, Waida'ani is more like mutfa, then later davening is more murgish. By Shemoneh you get to muskel. So the levels he's talking here are very much, can be applied in many, many situations, even in the same person, or different stages in a person's life, or different stages in the day, or in the year. And the same thing can be applied on a macrocosm on the entire nation, that there are neshamas that, not everybody's a Tana and Amir. That's correct. Not different people serve in different ways, but there's always overlap and there's always Atzilus, interconnectivity where everybody has everything in general. But this will be discussed when we finish with Imi. It'll become very clear how these three levels exist in every person's Avodah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So as I said, we stop here at the end of this paragraph. I will do the parentheses, and then the next paragraph, as you see, he's going to move to Imi, the next level, which is the mother. And there we're going to learn that it's not just equal, but it's actually mashpia into, becomes like the mother that mashpia into Zah, which is going to be interesting. Because here we talked about it's almost like a lower level than Zah, same stature, but it's still a younger sister, so to speak. So we'll see how that evolves. Okay, so I'm stopping.